Hello, my name is Laura Thomas and I'm a woven textile artist, designer, maker, lecturer and curator. So basically I'm just interested in weaving in all of its guises. Now, welcome to my weave workshop. I'm based in Bridgend in South Wales and I've been in business for about 16 years. And that followed about 7 years of further higher and postgraduate education. So I'm a real specialist in weaving. It's just my total passion. Now, if you have a look at my website, which is laurathomas.co.uk, you'll see that I work in lots of different ways. My work really does span all the different areas and facets of woven textiles. So sometimes I work in a really traditional way, making fabrics that are suitable for blankets and home furnishings. But I also really like to push the boundaries of what people expect a woven textiles maker to do. So I do quite a lot of work where I'm exploring mixing materials and disciplines together. So I encapsulate textiles in acrylic resin to make sculptures such as this, and you can see this is a sort of a loose threads structure where the yarns have been encapsulated in the acrylic resin. I also take that principle through to glass as well, so I've done some really large scale architectural commissions where the threads have been laminated in glass. Now, you've been sent some materials and a frame loom as part of the Criw Celf programme, and I'm really looking forward to taking you through the process of getting started weaving. So we're going to look at making something like this. And so I'm going to take you through lots of different techniques, talk about the yarns, the processes, the principles to create a small wall hanging like this. You don't have to hang it on the wall, but you can see I've got mine on a rod here, but you could obviously just leave it as a flat piece of fabric if you want to. So I'm really looking forward to getting started, taking you through that process. So let's get going. Okay, so now we are ready to start weaving some weft yarn. So remember, our warp is the vertical threads and our weft are the horizontal threads. And what I'm going to do first of all, if I just show you with this exemplar piece here, I'm going to lift up all of these knots and show you this woven piece here. So this is how we need to get started. We always need to have a band of some straightforward weaving to secure the edge. Now I'm going to use some slightly thicker threads than the ones that came in the box, just so that I can show a little bit more clearly what I'm doing on this video, and it'll be a bit quicker as well. So I'm going to measure off a piece of yarn. Now I would suggest not going for anything more than about 1.5 meters. Anything more than that and you're going to end up getting a little bit of a pickle doing the weaving. You might get into a little bit of a tangle, so that should be sufficient. Now this thread, at first glance, you probably think that's not going to get through that hole, but if you've got a thick thread, what you need to do is to very tightly twist the end like so into a small point, and then it can just nudge through enough for you to be able to pull it through that hole like so. Okay, now you don't need to knot that onto this needle, you just need to pull it through and have one tail that's much longer than the other. Okay, so don't have them exactly the same. Okay, and then to get started, all you need to remember is under, over, under, over. If you can do that, you will be absolutely fine. So taking the needle shuttle, I'm going to go over the first warp thread and under the next. Over, under, all the way through. Like so. And please also just notice that I'm doing this not at the very edge of the frame, because that would be quite tricky to manoeuvre. I'm about 4 centimetres up from the edge, and that's much easier for me to manoeuvre through. Then I pull the yarn through the threads, keep on going until there's a tail left behind. Okay, obviously don't keep on pulling, because if you do, you will just unravel the thread that you've just woven. And then that needs to be nudged down to the bottom, which you can do with your fingers, or you could use the shuttle, or you could use like a really wide toothed comb. Okay, now what we're going to do is travel back from the other side, and I'm going to have to turn this upside down because I'm right-handed and I always hold the shuttle with the right hand, and it's just easier to turn the frame upside down each time I need to weave. So if you look at your very last journey that the weft thread took, you can see it's gone under the edge warp thread. So this time I need to go over the first, because we're going to return back doing the same over, under, but in the opposite sequence to that first row. Okay, so it's useful to keep looking at your previous row of weaving and checking what you're doing this time is the opposite. So keep going all the way across, and when you're happy, you can pull your thread through. Now this time I now need to pull that shorter bit of yarn, that tail, through by hand. There we go. And I'm going to nudge that wool to the bottom again with my fingers. And that is your first 2 rows of weaving done. Now you can see that we've got this tail here hanging out. We can either deal with all of those at the very end and sort of sew them back into the fabric, but what I find is actually easier is to deal with it when they're actually when we're actually weaving. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pull that back up out of the way, so you've got this little sort of triangular space, and I'm going to take this tail of thread, and I'm using my fingers, I'm just going to thread it in and out of the warp threads in the opposite sequence of that first row, because if I did the same I would just be pulling it out. And we just need to go in and out a couple of times like so, and then pull the thread to the back of the loom. So there you can see there's that waste bit of thread, and then if I pull my second row of weaving back down on top of it, you can see that we've now got a nice neat edge. You can hardly see that you've got a doubled up bit of weft thread here. And what we'll do afterwards is that all of these tails of yarn will just be trimmed close to the edge of the fabric, and they will not come undone. As long as this is tightly woven and you're not sort of manipulating or wrestling with the fabric afterwards, it'll stay perfectly in place. So now I've just turned the loom back around again so I can come back from this side and head back over, doing the same under over in the opposite way to that previous row of weaving. Pull my thread across, and you can see that these metal edges now are really coming into their own. They stop us from pulling our thread too tightly, because quite often people can end up with a real pull in at the end of their fabrics unless that we've got these metal struts. So they'll help you keep it nice and straight. And then push that all down to the bottom and back over. So this is plain weave, also sometimes known as tabby weave. This is the most basic fundamental weave structure, and this is it. So I'm going to try and weave all of this piece of thread, so I've got that nice thick band of plain weave at the bottom of my woven fabric. And as you're probably figuring out, the thicker your threads, the quicker it is to weave. Okay, so that's why I'm choosing to work with this slightly thicker yarn this time, so that it can build up fairly quickly and it's quite clear to see what is going on. then each time I need to release a bit of my weft yarn, I'm just sort of pulling it through the needle to give myself a bit more to weave with. And then I think I can probably do another 2 rows perhaps. Yeah, I can get 1 more row out of this, I think. There we go. And then, as in the same way, as I said before, I could just unravel this now and leave that tail to deal with at the very end, but I am going to leave in that area there. I am just going to weave this back in and out a couple of times and take the tail to the back of the fabric. So again, I need to remember to look at that previous row of weaving there and take the same journey over and under the warp threads a couple of times, like so, taking my needle with that end bit of thread to the back of the fabric, unthread it like so, pull that through, and then nudge that down with my fingers. So there we go. Because that's a slightly longer tail, I think I might just trim this a little bit now. So I'm going to take it to that point and just give them both a little trim, just so it's a bit easier to see what's going on from this side. So there we go. That's our first stripe of weaving completed. Okay, so now we are ready to start having a look at how to create the tied in tassels at the end of your wall hanging. So I have already prepared a series of threads that I want to knot in. This is a thicker wool roving. I've got 10 pieces, all of the same length. Now I've got 10 pieces because I've got 20 warp threads in total, and I need 1 of these for every 2 warp threads. So taking your wool roving, divide it into 2. Put the loop at the top here over your edge 2 warp threads. Take the right hand cut end first of all, and you want to thread that underneath the right hand warp thread in this pair here, and then take your left hand cut thread, place that underneath the edge left thread of this pair. Take the 2 cut ends and hold them together between your finger and thumb, and then pull down like so. And then you have got a knotted in piece of thread like so. Now you just need to keep on doing this all the way across the width of your fabric now. So I'm taking the next 2 group of warp threads, the right hand cut end under the right thread into the center, and then doing the same with the left hand piece of thread under the left warp thread to the center. Grab those 2 together and pull tightly like so. And there you go. You've got a full row of hand knotted tassels to finish off the edge of your woven wall hanging. Now, there's nothing stopping you from repeating this elsewhere on your woven wall hanging. If you decide you want to have another row of knots, just make sure you do at least 2 rows of plain weave going from edge to edge before you do your next row of knots. That plain weave will hold the fabric together and give it its integrity when it comes off the frame. Okay, so now that we've got our knots in place, we can carry on with our weaving. So I've already woven a couple of rows of this pink, and I am going to do another couple. Now what I'm actually going to show you next, as once you've got your straight sort of stripes of weaving kind of sorted, it's quite nice to know how to create these undulating lines and shapes within your fabric. Okay, so the way to do this is actually really simple. So I'm going to get started with this row of weaving, but what I'm actually going to do is that I'm not going to go to the very end. I have brought the needle shuttle out onto the surface over the final 3 warp threads. So I am not weaving all the very way to the edge. And when I come back across now, I'm just going to go under that adjacent thread at the edge. So basically I'm weaving into all of the warp threads apart from the edge to here. There we go. And when I do my next 2 rows of weaving, this time I'm only going to weave as far as this point here. So there's going to be 4 fewer warp threads woven into on these next 2 rows. And each time I do this, I'm going to shift back across, and you will soon see that we're building up a lovely sort of diagonal, gentle diagonal line. If you want it steeper, then I would do a couple of rows at the sort of the same position here, rather than shifting across every 2 rows. So maybe do it every 4 rows instead, and that will give you a steeper line. But I want these to be quite a gentle curve. And you can see this time I've gone further across. Okay, so now we can see we've got 6 unwoven warp threads at the edge. So you just got to sort of follow your nose as to what you want this shape to look like. You can be quite free with it, quite organic with it. And the great thing about weaving is if you do something that isn't looking quite right, you can unweave really easily. You can just unthread your weft yarn out of the warp threads. Oops, I've gone a little bit too far there. There we go. go, and I think I'll do 2 more rows. There we go, and I think I'm going to leave that just there. I'm going to do the same thing as I did before with the tail bit of thread, and I'm just going to weave that in and out just a couple of times underneath that final row of weaving, taking the tail to the back of the fabric like so. There we go. Now we've got a lovely gentle sloping line that has been woven there, and when you are ready we can start sort of filling in the that unwoven area using the same sort of principle as we've done here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to start to weave and fill in this shape around the pink that we've just done. So I have threaded some grey yarn onto my shuttle so that we've got a really nice clear contrast to what we've woven already, and I'm going to go all the way across this time. And this time when I knock the thread down, you can see it's going to be positioned in this sort of curved line, so this is going to create sort of outline against the pink. And I'm going to go all the way back across. Like so. And don't forget, I'm going to just tuck in this little tail as I've done before, in and out just a couple of rows, like so. And just pull that thread through and push it down with my fingers. And back across. Now obviously I could keep going from edge to edge like that if I wanted to, and keep going, creating this sort of a big long stripe of this grey. But now that I've done those 3 rows, what I'm going to do is on my next row is I think I'm just going to weave to about this point somewhere, and I want to start sort of filling in this area here in all the grey and then build it up here a little, I think. So here we go. Now what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going a little bit further back across again, because what I actually want to do is try and create a bit of a curve up this way here. So I need to build up a bit of extra volume here. So I can be very intuitive and instinctive, making these decisions as I'm weaving. And as I said before, weaving is very editable. If there's something that you don't like, you can unweave very easily. Now I'm probably going to have to cut myself some more of this grey thread. Haven't quite got enough, but I can do a little bit more by hand at this point when it's too short to still be on the needle. There we go. Actually, that doesn't look too bad. I think I'm going to leave that there. There we go. So now we've got this nice undulating shape going in the other direction here. Okay, next I'm going to show you how to do the sumac stitch. So that's this one here that you can see in the bright yellow. And I called it a stitch because it is kind of like sewing into the weaving as part of the weave process. So you can see I've just woven another little stripe here of this mottled yarn, and I'm going to use this same yellow thread because it's really lovely and vibrant and hopefully quite clear for you to see what I'm doing. So I've cut quite a long piece of thread. It's about 6 times the width of my fabric. Now I'm not going to use all that, but you're definitely going to use more than you actually think, and it's better to have more to trim away than to run out of yarn whilst you're doing this. Now once again I have divided this into 2, so I'm going to be holding the loop end, and that's the end that we're going to get started with. So what we're going to do is take that loop and thread it underneath the edge 2 warp threads here. I am then going to pass the rest of the yarn through that loop like so, and then pull tight. So it's very similar to creating the knots like we did down here, but this time we're going to be working horizontally. So that's our first one done. Now this is going to get a little trickier as we move along, but hopefully you can see what I'm doing. So I've identified the next 2 warp threads here. Just going to split these 2 threads apart like so, taking the end of this pair of threads, I'm going to thread them underneath and into the center of those 2 warp threads there. So if I just pull it to that point there, hopefully you can see fairly clearly what I'm doing. So I'm kind of going under and around that 4th thread. Okay, so you can see I've gone under, I'm in the center, and as I pull it tight, there we go. You can see that lovely sort of curved shape that's being made on the surface. And I'm just going to continue repeating that all the way across the width. So again, I'm taking the next 2 warp threads, taking the end of this yellow yarn, the 2 end pieces, underneath the 6th warp thread into the center, pulling it through and around like so. Now I'm doing this fairly loosely. I could pull it a little bit tighter, but I think if I leave it looser, it's a bit clearer to see what I'm doing. And then, as I say, we just keep on going across the width. So to remind, this is called sumac, which is spelt S-O-U-M-A-C-K. Some people spell it without the K. And it's a really traditional weave structure that you can find in many sort of ethnographic textiles around the world. One thing that's rather nice about it is that it really does hide the warp threads, and you get this nice sort of relief surface texture, which is very much like stitching. And what I'm doing here really is a large scale stitch into the warp threads as part of the weave process. So it gets a little bit easier to do as we get towards the end here, because we're manoeuvring less thread each time. There we go, and now we're on to the last one. And there we go. Now obviously you can see we've got those tail threads on the edge at the moment. What I will do afterwards, once this comes off the frame loom, is that I would take those edge threads to the back and I will stitch them in on the reverse, so those tails are really hidden away like all of these other ones here. But for the time being, it's going to have to stay hanging out of the side of the fabric. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at creating these bobbly effects within the weaving. And to do this, we're going to use some wool roving. So wool roving is basically unspun wool fibre. So this is what you usually use when you're doing a felted fabric. It comes in these quite sort of thick chunks. I'm not going to use a whole section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of divide this into 2 and pull out a section like so. And this is still quite chunky, but probably about 1/3 of what it was originally. So you can see I've got a piece that is about 2 times, a little bit more than twice the width of the weaving. So we need some extra length for this, because as we pull the bobbles out of the fabric, we're obviously going to be using some of the width. So make sure you've got a long enough piece to start with. Now, because of the thickness of this, I'm going to weave this in and out of the warp threads by hand first of all. So this is a little tricky once we're getting to the end of the fabric, but not impossible. And as you go, pull it each time so it's going across the width of the warp threads. So there we go, nearly there. So there we go. We've got that right across the width of the fabric. And I've now pulled that into position, so I've got about the same amount of unwoven roving at either side. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the middle, and I am just pulling a little loop out of the fabric. And as I did that, I was trying to pull some of the yarn, some of the roving yarn from either side. Then I'm going to hold on to that loop and pull up the next one and work my way across. I'm still holding on to that central loop, so as I pull, I'm just pulling in from the edge here. And I'm trying to make all of these loops roughly the same size. It doesn't matter if they're not, but there we go. Got these lovely sort of loops on the surface. I'm going to continue that all the way across, but of course there's nothing stopping you from just leaving that unlooped. So you could have areas that were looped as opposed to woven in. Once again, I'm going to hold on to that central loop so it doesn't dislodge out of place as I then pull up the next bit. And I'm just going to keep holding on to that next loop each time I work my way across. Like so. So there we go, that's not too bad, it's fairly equal on either side. Again, we've got these little tufts hanging out from either side, which I will neaten up afterwards by stitching them into place on the reverse. So now to finish off, I'm just going to weave in this final section here, and then we'll be ready to take it off the loom. Okay, so I've finished weaving now, and you can see I've filled in as much of this gap at the top as I can. This is as far as I can really go comfortably. You want to leave yourself enough space to be able to take the fabric off the loom and create some loops to be able to hang it onto a stick or a rod of some description. Now the first thing we're going to do is take out the metal side pieces which have kept our edges nice and neat. So if you remember, at this end we've got these little screw things to take out. So I'm just going to unscrew that on both sides, like so. And then I can carefully, from the other end, pull that out, and the same on the other side. And you can see it's left behind a nice neat edge to our weaving. What I'm then going to do is take the fabric off the loom from this edge first of all. So I'm going to take off those pieces of masking tape, and you will now understand how this is a lot easier to take off rather than undoing a knot. So I'm unravelling that on that side, and the same from this side as well. So what we need to do now is to carefully now nudge all of these loops off the notches. It can be quite tricky at these points here where the little circles are. So what I find I sometimes need to do is to kind of use another tool like a needle or a pair of scissors to sort of just help nudge those loops off, but we'll see how we get on now. It's certainly much easier in the center here, so you can see I'm using my fingernails to just move them forwards like so. And yeah, those ones I don't think I can move, so what I'm going to do is use this tapestry needle to do that little bit of nudging, like so. I guess if you haven't got a needle like this, you could use a knitting needle or a skewer, or maybe even a nail. Whatever you choose to use, just take care. There we go, got it now. So there you go, they've all been nudged forwards a little bit, so now I can completely take them off. There we go. So that has now been freed from the bottom edge of the loom. Now you'll notice that there are quite big loops here, but what you can do, because this is so closely woven to the edge, you can just nudge those first rows of weaving down, and then that will fully occupy that space. these beginning and end bits of our warp thread will be sewn into the back of the fabric in a moment. So I'll thread those onto a needle and show you how to neaten that up. So at the other end, we need to do exactly the same thing and take all of these loops off. So just do it carefully, one at a time. This is much easier because there's no longer any tension on that warp thread. But obviously the last one doesn't want to come off. There we go, got it. There we go. So I'm going to just take the frame out of the way now, so it's out of the way. There we go, so there's all of those loops. Now, what you could do is just thread that straight onto a stick if you wanted to. If you wanted to keep a really neat, strict edge along that edge there before looping it, what you could do, as I've done on this piece here, is to tie little knots, and I think I'll do that again. So you can just at least see the difference between the two options and decide which one you prefer. So I'm just tying that into a little knot right close to the edge of the fabric, like so. Now, as I say, if I wanted to leave them just like that, I could just thread it straight onto a stick. So I've got a bit of driftwood here already, and I can just show you how you could thread that straight on. If you're going to do that, can you see I've done a little twist here? That would help keep things in place. You could obviously do a few more twists if you wanted to, like so, before threading onto the stick. Now, what you can also notice is that once you tie a knot like that, can you see that you've lost some of the length there? So you just need to bear that in mind depending on what you want to thread it onto. So with this one here, this piece of driftwood, it's now probably a little bit too short for me to get onto this piece of driftwood, but that's okay. So there we go. I'm going to carry on knotting these now. So there we go, we've got all of those knotted into place, and what I'm going to do now is thread it onto this stick, which will act as the hanging device. So you could either just thread it in like so and have a little bit of space hanging down. If you want your stick a little bit closer, what you could do, as I have done on this one here, is loop it around twice. I think there might be enough room to do that. So it's in once, twist back on itself, and thread it through again, like so. Okay, so you would just continue that all the way across. I'm just going to thread it through once because it's just going to be a little bit easier, and I think I quite like the idea of having a bit more of a gap on this one. There we go. So all we need to do now is to tidy up a couple of little edges. So if I turn this over now, what I'm going to do first of all is show you how to stitch in these warp threads. So I'm using a really chunky needle. This is a plastic needle, a tapestry needle, and I am just going to thread this warp end through, and what I'm going to do is follow the line of the next warp thread over, and I'm just going to stitch in and out like so up until this point, pull the thread to the surface of the fabric and pull that through. I can then trim that, and that tail, yes, we can see it on the reverse, but that is not going to be going anywhere as long as you don't wrestle with the fabric. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. There we go. I'm now going to just trim some of these other tails a little closer to the surface of the fabric. Now I have these 2 yellow threads which I also need to neaten away on the reverse. So once again I'm going to take one of these threads and thread it onto my tapestry needle, and I'm just going to tuck it underneath these couple of warp threads on the back, and you will see that you can't see the blue needle at all on the front here. So as I stitch that in, you're going to see no trace of it on the front of the fabric. And I'm just going to do the same now with the other bit of yarn. And follow the same route here. So if we look at the front now, you can't see any hint of how we've stitched that in on the back. So once you're happy with it, again, give it a trim, and there you go. And there is your finished woven wall hanging. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to do this, and I look forward to seeing what you make. Thank you very much.